What's going on? I'm KM Best. Let's take a look at the best decks to play in Conquest. The Conquest meta is very similar to the meta in tournaments so far. So what you're going to see a lot of are straightforward decks with straightforward win cons. And because not a lot of people are used to battle mode, one advantage you can get is by playing a deck that is just easy to play, easy for you to know when to snap, easy for you to know when to retreat, and easy to understand on a basic level. Now, this Lockjaw deck definitely does that. This is the classic high evolutionary Lockjaw list, although we have opted against Dracula and the Infinite in an attempt to make the deck a little bit more consistent with the inclusion of America Chavez, and of course, we include one tech slot, in this case, Killmonger. Killmonger is basically just here to make our already pretty decent matchup against high evolutionary lockdown decks, which rely very heavily on Sunspot and Nebula, much better. And Killmonger does an admirable job of that. It's also okay into Kitty Pryde, but Kitty Pryde is a genuine threat to this list. There aren't a lot of decks that go over the top of a good Lockjaw high roll, but Kitty Pryde really can. So if you really want to respect that list, you can include a Wave instead of the Killmonger. One note, though, is that if you're playing Wave, you're in a little bit of an awkward spot in mirrors because people are going to be able to play their big stuff for free. It's a good thing to do, but it's not what I would do right now. I think the Killmonger does enough against the Kitty decks and does a ton against the Evo Lockdown decks, so I would include the Killmonger over the Wave. The Evo Lockdown deck has been a dominant part of the metagame just on pure power, even after taking a nerf with Spider-Man seeing a cost increase up to 5. We still are playing the exact same 12 cards that we were playing previously. Now, you can definitely play around with the Luke Cage spot in this list. I include it because I'm only really worried about mirrors, but if you're worried about the Lockjaw deck, I think a Shang-Chi would be a great way to start trying to target that. You can definitely steal lanes back from them if you want to play Shang-Chi instead of Luke. You end up losing a bit in the mirrors, but you still get a lot of value. Now, part of the reason the Lockjaw deck is good against this deck is just they are very able to go with multiple lanes. Thor, so Mjolnirs can happen later. Mjolnir Odin can even buff that lane even more. And also they run Doctor Doom. So you do have a bit of a natural predator out there, but it should be all right as long as you understand how to play that matchup, and you probably will run into that matchup a fair bit. I still have a ton of respect for this list. It is doing fundamentally powerful things. Scam a lane and then scam another one, or scam a lane and then Hulk the other one. It's just strong. It's just good. This is Marvel Snap fundamentals. One thing you're going to want to keep in mind when you play a deck like this is that you're really going to want to know when you need to snap. So your snapping is going to get extra important when you play something like this because of how dangerous it can be to let your opponents off the hook by snapping like after you Spider-Man or something when the game is already clearly lost. Now, I know this is most people's first exposure for battle mode, and this deck will take some time for you to get used to those snap dynamics, because a lot of things that are like kind of okay on ladder over a long sample size will really matter when you are giving your opponent free cubes, when you are letting them stay in games they need to leave, when you are not taxing them for wanting to stay in the game. And this deck really wants you to tax them if they want to stay in the game. Our third high evolutionary deck of the day shows you a little bit more customizability. Now, this list that I'm showing you right now with Hazmat and Luke Cage in it is very specifically built for decks in a general sense, right? That's good against things that are going to want to be playing cards onto the board early. Hazmat, Luke Cage, very good. Hazmat is the best possible way to get a cheap abomination on the board. However, if you want to specifically target the high evolutionary Lockjaw list, one really good way to do that is to take out Hazmat and Luke Cage and run Scorpion and Shang-Chi. I think both of these are very viable builds right now. Personally, the build that you see there has been my most successful, but it's the 10 cards around it, not those two specific slots, that are making it work. Fundamentally, what's happening here is we're playing good cards, and then we have a lot of tech slots that we use to beat specific matchups. Rogue stealing your opponent's Luke Cage, obviously very powerful. Shang-Chi, if we get him in there, extremely good. Wave, locking down opponents like Kitty Pryde and Sera on the final turn of the game, leaving them unable to execute their explode on turn 6 strategies. And of course, Shang-Chi, if you can get him in there, doing the work. Now, there is not really a lot wrong with a list like this, but you are going to have to customize it to what you want to beat. I do think we go from unfavored to favored against Lockjaw by including Scorpion and Shang over the Hazmat Loot Cage combo, but I do think it's significantly worse in basically every other matchup. So it's definitely a consideration that you should take into consideration. Wow. A consideration that you should take into... Fuck. It's definitely something you should keep in mind when you play this on ladder. I'm not editing that out. I don't think I'm editing that out. Another list you can try to run is this Patriot list, although I do think that it tends to have a little bit of a lower point ceiling than several other lists you may run into, right? So the issue with Patriot that you'll run into is that Kitty Pryde can actually go bigger than it, and Lockjaw can also go bigger than it. And for that reason, we're back on the Iron Man game plan because our way of contesting a big lane out of the Lockjaw stuff is by playing Iron Man. We are generally unfavored against 2-lane decks and generally favored against 3-lane decks. So that does help us out a little bit. But without Wave, we are in a lot of trouble against Kitty unless we can specifically pull off Invisible Woman into Killmonger, which is incredibly powerful against Kitty Pryde, killing off Kitty Pryde and all their other one-cost cards too. So that you have lines of play, but one thing you have to understand with a deck like this is you need to be very strategic with your snaps and retreats because you have some cards in the deck like Patriot or Invis KM against Kitty Pryde that are just going to be way stronger in specific matchups than basically anything else. If you run into a Galactus player, you're snapping when you get debris, right? Like, that's how you have to think about when you play this deck is, do I have the cards that are good in this matchup? That is the thing you need to focus on when you snap. And you genuinely do have to be aggressive with it because if you do not, your opponent will be aggressive to you and you will find yourself on the losing end of battle modes. Finally, I do want to talk about what it means to just take a deck that can absolutely get countered and then just run it anyway. And I think this is a great example of how you can still succeed with a deck that has very obvious counters. So one of the things that you'll notice first about this list, we're running Elektra. It's a little hypothetical here. We're just trying to figure out if it's good. I saw WW Los, or W as he goes now, post this list, say he's been doing really well with it. So I wanted to try it out. I found that I wanted to make the curve a little bit lower, but I did like having Shang-Chi. I think Shang-Chi is just a great card right now because of the preponderance of the Hulk running around right now out of High Evolutionary, and of course he's even better into the Lockjaw deck that you are already a little bit favored into. So the Elektra here is just a concession to the idea that, like, hey, maybe if we blow up a Sunspot or a Nebula, they won't expect that on their Storm lane and we can sneak a win out of that, or at least force them to play Dr. Doom on 5, on Dr. Doom on 6 instead of playing the Hulk on 6. So we can restrict their options in that way by playing the Elektra. I don't know for sure that it's good. It's been pretty okay for me, but I wouldn't get yourself tied to it, basically. Now, as far as the rest of this, I do think you pretty much have to play something in that Shang-Chi slot. You cannot play normal bounce in battle mode. You want to be playing something so that you can do things and really swing games after a wave. And also keep in mind that you need to start being able to read your opponents by how they snap and how they behave, right? I've had games where my opponent is snapping and it's like, okay, based on what I've seen out of their deck, based on that snap, they're going to wave me on turn 5. That's the turn I want to play Mysterio, Hitmonkey, and something else, and I have to do that immediately. Shang-Chi is a great card that can really swing lanes in a way that no other card can after a wave. And for that reason, he's what we've got in here. I think there's some exploration to be done in terms of other cards that can fill that role. I'd love to get some more stuff in there because honestly, if people are snapping you on their waves, they're gonna be giving away that information. I almost think that if they're wave gamers, they should be like not snapping and just farming you every time they have it. I'm not really sure though, because of course, if you snap aggressively back, suddenly they're in trouble again. I think there's a lot of interplay to the way people snap with this deck that has been unexplored. And I think if you're going to play a deck like this, and this is a stand-in for basically every deck that loses to wave, you need to be paying attention when they snap and ask yourself why they're doing that. Because if they're snapping a wave, you can play around it. And that is something that's really important to understand. So I wanted to end the video focusing on a couple of reasonable choices you could make that are not going to be like the most competitive, but are going to be like significantly cheaper. So these lists are going to have almost all pool 3 cards in them. So you should be able to at least have a reasonable hope of getting them. That said, I do think that if you are sort of stuck on trying to acquire cards, the cheapest budget option you can make, and I know this doesn't sound right, but it is true, is to just go buy High Evolutionary, as long as you have Wasp, and play the Evolutionary Tech deck, but instead of Luke Cage and Hazmat, just play Scorpion and Shang-Chi. I think that's basically a side grade, better against Evo Lockjaw, and removes the requirement for a couple of pool 3 cards that you would otherwise have to open or acquire in another manner. So I think that that would be like, if I could make one budget recommendation, it would be that. It would be save your tokens for High Evolutionary, start with an Evo Tech deck. As you open up more of the good cards, you can move into Evo Lockjaw or Evo Lockdown. I think Evo Tech's going to be the easiest one for you to make, though. So that's where I would start. Of course, if you don't have Rogue for that list, you can play Enchantress. That said, if you happen to have a Silver Surfer, I believe he's the only card that is in Series 4 for this, and I think that is a very, very, very reasonable thing to do. As far as the 2-drops, I'm not really married to any of them. Like, if you want to play Goose, go off. I don't hate it, but I do think that there should be some consideration given to other 2s in this scenario, like Lizard or Stilk if you manage to open her, Jeff if you manage to open him. Although since this is budget focused, we're going with the Goose, we're going with the Scorpion. The key thing is we want to be able to play cards early in the game. One of the ways this deck really loses, if you just skip until turn 3 and then you play a 3, and a Sera, you get waved and you just die. And people are really able to snap on you once they know you're a Silver Surfer deck and you miss those early turns. They can just start bullying you. So you do have to be able to actually play some cards early and reasonably expect to be a normal deck, even if you don't have all your combo pieces to do the Sera into a bunch of stuff with Silver Surfer. You still just want to be able to put the pressure on, make them think twice about whether or not they're going to snap. This deck has some real upside into the lockdown decks if you can pull it off, but it is pretty reliant on drawing Silver Surfer, and that's just the kind of the price you're going to pay when you play something like this. There are a bunch of other versions of this, trying weirder cards like Dazzler and Shadow King. I've opted to not do that because those cards are weird and solve very specific problems, and you should play a default list before jumping into the deep end. I hope you enjoyed this look at my top decks for Conquest. Have you been succeeding with these decks? Have you been succeeding with other decks? Let me know what you've been playing in Conquest. I know I've run into a couple Galactus players. I'm not sure how good that deck is. I did end up losing one game of Proving Grounds to it when I completely misplayed and forgot how Mysterio worked. But I do think that it's like generally probably significantly weaker than it was, but it will still be a reasonable threat. It's just not going to have that overpowering ability to turn games into just binary conditions that it did before. I can tell you that it feels better to play against, just having more options for how to combat it, more things to think about. And so I almost included it, but having not played it myself, I didn't want to put it in this list. That said, consider it an honorable mention. If you've been succeeding with something, let me know in the comments. I read them all because I'm very, very dumb. Leave a comment, like, subscribe. I've been Cam Best. I will see you in the next one.